Tonight, we're stepping back thousands of years to a land of sand, stone, and secrets, ancient Egypt. In this special double feature, we'll first explore the entire story of Egyptian mythology, from the birth of the gods to the epic tales that shaped one of the world's oldest civilizations. Then, we'll uncover the grim reality behind one of history's most disturbing professions. Why being a mummy maker was one of the worst jobs ever. A job that was sacred, horrifying, and deeply misunderstood. So find a comfortable spot, let your eyes grow heavy, and allow the echoes of the past to carry you into a calm, relaxing sleep. For thousands of years, the myths of ancient Egypt shaped the hearts, hopes, and fears of an entire civilization. These were not just stories, they were the very foundation of how the world worked, how people lived, and how they died. Tonight, we journey into a world of gods and monsters, of sacred rivers and eternal deserts, of birth, betrayal, and rebirth. This is the entire story of Egyptian mythology. Long before the first stone of the pyramids was laid, before the Nile carved its path through golden sand, before names like Osiris or Isis echoed across temple walls, there was only one thing: none, the vast, formless, eternal ocean of darkness. There was no sky, no sun, no land, no time, just infinite, silent water, an endless void, heavy and still. But from this endless chaos came a single spark, a ripple on the surface of nothingness, a moment of will. And from that moment emerged a mound, the Benben, the first land to rise from the waters, a small sacred hill upon which the first god appeared. His name was Atum. Unlike the gods who would follow, Atum had no parents, no creator. He existed purely by force of will. He was the beginning and the end, the creator of all that was and all that would ever be. Standing upon the mound, Atum surveyed the dark waters of Nun and began the work of shaping the world. But he was alone. To remedy this, Atum gave birth to 2 children. How exactly he did this was the subject of different beliefs. Some said he sneezed them out. Others said he spat them into being, or brought them forth through his own essence. Regardless of the method, his children were Shu, the god of air and breath, the space between all things; Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, dew, and balance. Together, Shu and Tefnut embodied the essential elements of life: air and water, breath and flow, lightness and cohesion. But one day, the 2 vanished. Atum was heartbroken. He sent his eye, a divine force or part of his own being, to search for them in the watery chaos. When they were finally found and returned, Atum wept with joy. And where his tears touched the earth, the first humans were born. Shu and Tefnut, now reunited, gave birth to 2 more gods. Geb, the god of earth, who lay flat and steady; Nut, the goddess of the sky, who arched protectively above. Nut and Geb were deeply in love, so inseparable in fact that they clung together in a passionate embrace, forming a union of earth and sky. But their closeness threatened to stifle creation. There was no room for light, for movement, for life to blossom. So Atum, sometimes with the help of Shu, forced them apart. Shu lifted Nut high above, becoming the air that separated sky from earth. Geb remained below, becoming the soil, the rocks, the foundation of the world. To the Egyptians, this wasn't metaphor. It was literal. Each morning, Nut gave birth to the sun. She swallowed it each evening, carrying it through her body until it rose again. The stars were her children, twinkling across her body in the night sky. Beneath her, Geb provided everything humans needed to live: plants, crops, animals, and the ground they walked on. Now that the world had air, sky, land, and water, creation could truly begin. And so the next generation of gods was born: Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, 4 siblings who would bring order, love, betrayal, death, and resurrection into the world. But before we meet them, we must understand. To the ancient Egyptians, this myth was not fiction. It was reality woven into metaphor. When they looked up at the stars, they saw Nut. When they stood barefoot on the warm soil, they stood upon Geb. When the wind blew, it was Shu passing between them. And when they cried, they remembered Atum's tears, the tears that gave birth to mankind. Egyptian mythology didn't separate gods from nature. The gods were nature. They were the forces of existence given names and stories so people could understand their world. This is how everything began. From the dark silence of Nun to the first breath of Shu and the first drop of Tefnut's dew. From the embrace of Nut and Geb and the sorrowful joy of Atum's lonely creation. And it was only the beginning. Because the world, now formed, was about to be tested. A sacred order had been set in place, and it would soon be broken. As the world settled into form, and the elements of air, earth, water, and sky took their places, the divine family expanded. From the union of Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess, 4 powerful deities were born. They were Osiris, wise, just, and beloved. He would become the king of all Egypt and the god of fertility and renewal. Isis, Osiris's sister and wife, the goddess of magic, motherhood, and healing. Set, their brother, lord of chaos, storms, and the scorching desert. Nephthys, sister of Isis, a quieter goddess linked to morning, night, and protection. These 4 gods would define the fate of all life on earth and in the underworld. Osiris, eldest among them, became the king of Egypt, not just of the gods, but of the living people as well. He was a kind and visionary ruler, said to have taught humans the secrets of farming, animal husbandry, architecture, and religious worship. Under his rule, the land flourished. Crops grew tall, the Nile flowed calmly, and the people thrived. Isis stood by his side, not as a queen who lingered in the background, but as an equal. She used her magical powers to protect the kingdom, cure diseases, and guide souls. The world was in harmony for a while, but not everyone rejoiced. In the shadows, Set, Osiris's younger brother, brooded with resentment. Set ruled over the dry, wild deserts, where storms raged and the earth cracked. His realm was the antithesis of Osiris's fertile lands. While Osiris brought life, Set lived in chaos, and chaos hates order. Worse still, the people adored Osiris. They sang his name in prayers. They built statues in his honor. They gave offerings, not to Set, but to the just and noble king. Set felt invisible, powerless, unloved. And so, he began to plot. Set's plan was as brilliant as it was cruel. He commissioned a beautiful coffin, exquisitely crafted, made of the finest cedar, inlaid with gold and precious stones. But it was no ordinary coffin. It was made to fit Osiris's exact body. Then, at a grand banquet attended by gods and mortals alike, Set brought forth the coffin as a gift. With feigned generosity, he announced, "Whosoever fits perfectly inside this chest shall receive it as a gift." One by one, the guests tried. Some were too tall, some too short. All failed. Then Osiris stepped forward. He lay inside. Of course, it fit him perfectly. In that instant, Set and his followers slammed the lid shut, sealed it with molten lead, and locked it tight. Before anyone could stop him, Set cast the coffin into the Nile. The river carried it away, Osiris trapped inside, alive. The banquet erupted into panic, but it was too late. Osiris, king of Egypt, was gone. Isis's grief was immeasurable. Her husband, her brother, her king, stolen in an instant. But she did not collapse in despair. She searched. Disguised as a mortal woman, she wandered Egypt and beyond, asking animals, children, and even the winds for answers. Finally, she found the coffin. It had washed ashore in Byblos, a faraway land. There it had become embedded in the trunk of a great tamarisk tree. The locals, unaware of what lay inside, had used the tree's wood as a pillar in their king's palace. Isis, ever clever, found a way into the palace. She revealed her true identity and retrieved the coffin. At last, she had Osiris back. But her joy was short-lived. Set, learning of her success, was filled with fury. This time, he wouldn't risk another chance. He found the body of Osiris, tore open the coffin, and hacked the corpse into 14 pieces. Then, in a fit of rage, he scattered the body parts across the land of Egypt, from the delta to the desert. Each piece was thrown to a different corner, so no one could ever restore Osiris again. Set had not just murdered his brother, he had desecrated him, defiled him, made him disappear into the earth itself. But Isis was not done. With unmatched devotion, Isis began her second journey. She sailed the Nile in a papyrus boat. She followed whispers of jackals, signs in the stars, clues in dreams. With the help of her sister Nephthys, the two women recovered every part of Osiris, except for one. His phallus, which had been swallowed by a fish, was lost forever. But even incomplete, Isis would not give up. With the guidance of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and funerary rites, the sisters anointed the body with sacred oils. They wrapped it in linen bandages. They performed the first mummification. Then, Isis used her most powerful magic, older than time itself, to breathe life into Osiris. For one brief, miraculous moment, he lived again. From this union, Isis conceived a child, a son who would grow up to challenge Set himself. His name was Horus. Osiris, though briefly alive, could not stay in the land of the living. His body was too damaged. His time had passed. Instead, he descended into Duat, the Egyptian underworld. But he did not fall into darkness. He rose as its king. Osiris became the lord of the dead, the judge of souls, the silent presence that awaited every person after death. The land of the dead was not a place of punishment, but of judgment and rebirth. And Osiris, who had suffered, died, and risen again, was the perfect ruler of that realm. He was no longer king of Egypt, but king of eternity. This myth of Osiris's murder, Isis's devotion, Set's betrayal, and the birth of Horus was more than a tale. It was the foundation of Egyptian religion. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth echoed through every funeral, every tomb painting, every prayer offered by the living to their ancestors. It explained why the Nile flooded, why crops died and returned, why kings must die to make way for new ones. And in the hearts of Egyptians, Isis became the symbol of motherly love and sacred magic. Osiris became the ultimate hope that even after death, something greater awaits. And Set, though feared, was necessary. Chaos must exist so that order can triumph over it. But the story did not end there, because somewhere, growing in secret, was Horus, a child of prophecy, destined to avenge his father and restore balance to the world. And so began the greatest divine rivalry of them all. Horus was born in secret, hidden away in the marshes of the Nile Delta. Isis, fearing that Set would discover and destroy him as he had done to Osiris, raised her son in silence and shadow. She taught him everything she knew, magic, wisdom, and the truth about what had been done to his father. As Horus grew, so too did his strength and resolve. He knew his life had one purpose: to challenge Set and reclaim the throne of Egypt. When he was old enough, he emerged from hiding and stepped forward to make his claim before the Council of the Gods. Set, unsurprisingly, refused to relinquish the throne. He declared Horus too young, too unproven, and accused Isis of manipulating events through sorcery. The gods were divided. Some, like Thoth and Hathor, supported Horus. Others, swayed by Set's power and intimidation, hesitated. The gods decided a series of trials would determine the rightful king. What followed was not a single battle, but a long and exhausting war, one that stretched for years, filled with duels, trickery, and divine contests that often bordered on the absurd. In one version, Horus and Set turned into hippos and fought each other in the Nile, splashing and thrashing like wild beasts. In another, Set challenged Horus to a boat race, using vessels made entirely of stone. Horus, ever clever, secretly built his from wood, but disguised it to look like stone. Set's boat sank instantly. Horus glided across the water. But the conflict wasn't just about strength. There were courtroom debates among the gods, passionate arguments, and dramatic betrayals. Isis herself intervened more than once, pleading with the gods to honor justice and restore the legacy of Osiris. At one point, Isis captured Set in a magical net and presented him before the gods. But Horus, angry that his mother had interfered instead of letting him win on his own, lashed out, cutting off her head in a moment of rage. The gods were horrified. Thoth, the god of wisdom, restored Isis using magic, but the rift between mother and son lingered. Set, too, fought with cunning and cruelty. In one tale, he gouged out Horus's eye during battle and buried it in the sand. The wound was severe, but Thoth healed Horus, and the eye, once restored, became a symbol of healing and protection for all Egyptians, the famous Eye of Horus. Eventually, after countless years of struggle, the gods convened for a final judgment. The council listened again to all sides, weighed the deeds, the trials, the sacrifices, and finally they chose Horus. He was declared the rightful king of Egypt, the heir of Osiris, and the new divine ruler of the living world. Set, though defeated, was not destroyed. Instead, he was cast out, banished to the desert, a god of storms and chaos who would forever remain at the edges of order, a reminder of what happens when power turns to jealousy. Horus ascended the throne, not just as a god, but as the symbol of every future pharaoh. From that moment on, every king of Egypt was seen as a living embodiment of Horus, continuing his legacy, maintaining the divine balance between chaos and order. Though the war had ended, its echoes never faded. The struggle between Horus and Set was etched into temple walls, whispered in sacred hymns, and remembered in every coronation for centuries to come. The kingdom of the gods had found peace again, but only for now. Not all gods ruled over grand wars, kings, or the afterlife. Many lived in the quiet places, the home, the fields, the classroom, the night sky. To the ancient Egyptians, the divine wasn't distant. It was present, woven into every corner of their daily lives. When a scribe picked up his reed pen, he whispered a prayer to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and time. Thoth was believed to have invented language itself, and his words were sacred. Every temple inscription, every legal decree, every love letter was written under his watchful eye. He carried the moon on his head, recording the passage of nights and days, marking time with precision. If a family welcomed a child, they thanked Hathor, the goddess of motherhood, beauty, and music. Often depicted with the ears of a cow or the horns cradling the sun disk, she brought joy, fertility, and celebration. Hathor danced at births, comforted the dying, and welcomed souls into the afterlife with her songs. In the kitchens and marketplaces, where people cooked, traded, and tended their homes, the gentle gaze of Bastet kept them safe. She was the cat goddess, fierce yet protective. Egyptians loved cats not just for their pest control, but because they carried Bastet's spirit. To harm a cat was to anger the goddess herself. Bastet was believed to ward off evil spirits, plagues, and misfortune. Her presence was felt in every flick of a tail or purr in the corner of a home. In the shadows and thresholds, where danger lurked, there was Bes, a strange, dwarf-like god with a lion's mane, wide eyes, and a perpetual grin. He looked odd, almost humorous, but he was beloved. Bes protected mothers during childbirth, guarded sleeping children, and frightened off nightmares. Images of Bes were carved into bed frames, painted on walls, and worn as amulets. No one feared Bes. He was the fear of fear itself. Then there was Ma'at, perhaps the most important goddess of all, yet invisible. She wasn't prayed to in hopes of miracles. She didn't demand grand temples or dramatic rituals. She was balance itself. Ma'at governed truth, justice, and the natural order. She was the force that kept the stars in place, the Nile flowing, the seasons turning. When people acted with honesty and fairness, they were said to be living in Ma'at. Even the gods bowed to her authority. Every court case, every royal decision, every weighing of the heart in the afterlife was judged by her standards. Her symbol was a simple ostrich feather, but that feather would decide the fate of your soul. And then there was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and the dead. Where Osiris ruled the underworld, Anubis walked its roads. He wrapped the dead, protected their bodies, and guided them through the first stages of the afterlife. Egyptians feared death, but not Anubis. He was not a god of punishment. He was a god of process, making sure the journey was safe, respectful, and complete. When a body was prepared for burial, it was Anubis who was invoked to ensure the organs were properly removed and placed into canopic jars. It was his face the priests wore as a mask during rituals, and it was Anubis who would lead the soul to its final judgment. Even the great sun god Ra, ruler of all life, was not some distant figure in the sky. He was the daily heartbeat of time itself. Every morning, Ra sailed across the heavens in his golden boat, bringing sunlight and warmth. Every night, he descended into the underworld, battling chaos to ensure that the dawn would return. People greeted the sunrise, not just as a natural event, but as the rebirth of Ra, proof that order had triumphed over darkness once again. Egyptian life was saturated with the divine. There was a god for beer, a goddess for scorpions, a deity for measuring grain. There were household gods that lived in closets and kitchen corners. Children wore protective charms shaped like frogs, crocodiles, and cobras, each representing a different spirit watching over them. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were energy centers where the divine and mortal realms touched. Priests bathed statues, offered food to them, and carried them in processions through the streets. But even in homes without statues, the gods were there, in amulets, in carved scarabs, in whispered prayers over breakfast. To modern minds, it may seem excessive. Hundreds of gods, rituals, and spells for everything from planting seeds to swatting flies. But to the Egyptians, this was how the world worked. They didn't believe in one story, one answer, or one path. Their mythology was a vast, shifting landscape where gods could merge, change forms, or contradict themselves. And that was fine, because life was the same, messy, layered, unpredictable. In this way, Egyptian mythology wasn't just a religion, it was a language, one that helped people make sense of birth, love, conflict, and loss. A way to understand why the river rose, why the sun set, why people die, and why dreams feel real. And in this language, the gods of daily life whispered constantly. They were not far away. They were everywhere. To the ancient Egyptians, death was never the end. It was a doorway, one that opened not into silence, but into a world just as vivid and structured as the one left behind. This belief shaped everything: how they lived, how they prayed, how they built their tombs, how they spoke of time. In life, one prepared for death, and in death, one hoped to live again. The journey after death was long. It was difficult, and it was not guaranteed. When a person died, their body was carefully preserved through the sacred process of mummification. This was not merely a practical step, it was spiritual. The body was seen as the house of the soul. If it decayed, the soul might become lost, unable to recognize itself in the afterlife. Priests removed the organs, dried the body with natron salt, wrapped it in linen, and anointed it with oils. Spells were recited. Charms and amulets were placed between layers of wrappings. Each step was a safeguard, a blessing, a promise. Once the body was placed in its coffin and the tomb sealed, the soul's journey truly began. The Egyptians believed the soul was made of several parts. The Ka, a person's vital essence. The Ba, their personality, their memories, their energy. And the Ak, a radiant form, the transformed spirit that could enter the eternal realms. The Ka remained near the body, needing offerings of food and drink to stay nourished. The Ba, often depicted as a bird with a human head, was free to move between worlds, visiting the living, watching over loved ones, or drifting through dreams. But both Ka and Ba needed to be reunited to form the Ak, and this could only happen after the soul completed its journey through Duat, the underworld. Duat was not a place of fire and punishment. It was more like a cosmic map, a vast, shifting realm filled with dangers, wonders, and gates. The soul would pass through 12 regions, each representing an hour of the night. The path was perilous. Serpents coiled in the darkness. Lakes of fire hissed beneath bridges of stone. Enormous gates blocked the way, guarded by fearsome beings with names as long and strange as the spells needed to pass them. To survive this journey, the soul relied on the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, passwords, and instructions, often written on papyrus scrolls and buried with the deceased. These texts weren't meant to scare. They were like travel guides for eternity. Sometimes the dead would sail on a boat, just as Ra did each night, battling the great serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos. Other times, the soul would walk on foot, guided by Anubis, who watched over them with calm, jackal eyes. Eventually, the soul reached its most important destination, the Hall of Two Truths. Here stood Osiris, now the king of the underworld. Seated on his throne, flanked by 42 judges, he waited to determine the fate of every soul that entered. But first, the soul underwent the weighing of the heart. Thoth, god of wisdom and scribe of the gods, stood nearby with his pen and scroll. Anubis brought forth a great scale. On one side, he placed the person's heart, the seat of thought and morality. On the other, he placed the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth and balance. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul had lived a life of harmony, honesty, and balance. They were allowed to enter the field of reeds, a paradise that mirrored the best parts of Egypt: green fields, calm waters, abundant harvests, and peace without end. But if the heart was heavy with lies, cruelty, or imbalance, it sank. Waiting beside the scale was a terrible creature, Amit, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile. Amit devoured the impure heart in one bite. The soul was erased, cast into oblivion. There was no eternal torment, just non-existence, To the Egyptians, that was the greatest fear of all, to be forgotten. Those who passed the judgment found themselves reborn. In the field of reeds, they were reunited with loved ones, lived in beauty, and enjoyed everything they loved in life, without pain, without aging, without end. But they were not locked in place. The Ak could still return to the world of the living. It could send messages through dreams, watch over family, appear as birds or breezes or sudden shivers in the night. The veil between life and death was not sealed. It was thin, and souls passed through it gently, respectfully. This belief made death less frightening for the Egyptians. Funerals were not only mournful, they were hopeful. Every tomb was a home. Every sarcophagus a vessel for eternity. The living wrote letters to the dead. They brought them food. They spoke their names aloud, for to be remembered was to remain alive. And the gods played their part in every step. Isis, protector of the dead. Nephthys, guardian of the tomb. Thoth, recorder of truth. Ma'at, keeper of balance. Osiris, judge and king. Anubis, gentle guide. Together they ensured that no one travelled alone. In the end, the journey through the afterlife was not about fear, but about transformation. The Egyptians believed that every soul, if properly prepared and true of heart, could rise again, renewed, eternal, and embraced by the gods. To them, death was simply a longer road, one that led home. Time passed, the winds shifted, the Nile rose and fell, and kingdoms crumbled like sand. The temples of Egypt, once alive with chanting priests and golden offerings, fell quiet. Statues were buried, scrolls forgotten, and the names of gods faded into the dust. But the stories remained. Whispers of Osiris, the dying king who rose again, of Isis, the devoted magician, of Horus, the falcon with fire in his heart, of Set, wild and unpredictable, of Ra, the ever-rising sun. They were carved into walls, painted in tombs, spoken in shadows. Egyptian mythology was never a fixed thing. It was fluid, like the river itself, changing, dividing, rejoining. Gods merged, took on new forms, faded, and returned. Over thousands of years, dynasties rose and reinterpreted the old tales. Some gods who were once mighty became minor. Others who were obscure became central. But they were never truly gone, because mythology was never just about gods. It was about people trying to understand the world around them, why the sun rises, why we dream, why we love, why we die. The myths offered explanations, comfort, meaning. They gave a face to the wind, a name to the stars, a purpose to sorrow. They turned the chaos of nature into a story, and in doing so, helped people live. In the villages, families still told the old tales. Farmers still looked to the Nile and remembered Hapi, the god of its floods. Children wore charms shaped like the eye of Horus, not knowing its full story, but trusting it would keep them safe. And even now, centuries later, the echoes continue. Modern scholars piece together fragments of papyrus. Tourists stand in the shadow of crumbling obelisks, gazing up at silent gods who once held the sky. Artists, writers, filmmakers, all draw from the well of Egyptian myth. It still fascinates, still inspires. Perhaps because at its heart, Egyptian mythology was never just about power, or fear, or grandeur. It was about balance, about living in harmony with the world, with each other, and with the divine. About remembering the dead, honoring the past, and preparing for what comes next. About finding eternity not in escape, but in connection. The gods may be quiet now, the priests long gone, but the stories, they live on, etched in stone, echoing through time, and maybe tonight, echoing softly in your dreams. For most people today, ancient Egypt conjures images of towering pyramids, golden tombs, and eternal splendor. Pharaohs ruled like gods, their lives immortalized in stone, their deaths dramatized in rituals meant to grant them everlasting life. But few ever stop to consider who made that immortality possible. Not the priests, not the scribes, but the people who did the dirtiest, most horrifying work of all, the mummy makers. These individuals were not philosophers or sages. They were workers, artisans in the truest and most grueling sense. Their job: to handle rotting bodies, slice open decaying flesh, stir brains into liquid, remove festering guts, and do it all under the scorching Egyptian sun. Day after day, corpse after corpse. Their role in the process of mummification was essential, yet their lives were marked by isolation, stigma, and a constant exposure to death and disease. This was not a noble craft. It was survival inside a nightmare. While society exalted the finished product, the carefully wrapped mummy, nestled in its ornately painted coffin, nobody talked about how it got that way. The truth is far from romantic. The art of embalming was brutal, dirty, and dangerously unhygienic. It was a process perfected over generations through sheer trial and error. And every step was more disturbing than the last. The place where this grim work began was not some pristine temple or sacred chamber. It was a makeshift structure, usually a tent or hut, known as the wabet, the house of purification. Situated close to the Nile for access to water, the wabet was less like a place of worship and more like a crude butcher's stall. Heat radiated off the linen walls. Flies hovered in thick clouds. The floor was hard-packed dirt, soaked with fluids. There were no windows, only flaps tied open for ventilation. Inside, the tools of the trade lay waiting. Bronze hooks, obsidian blades, rough linen strips, and pottery jars filled with various materials. This was the operating room of the afterlife, and it smelled like death. The body would arrive already, starting to decompose. In the Egyptian heat, it didn't take long. Despite the religious importance of burial, not everyone died in their homes. Soldiers fell on the battlefield. Laborers collapsed far from the city. It might take a day or more for a body to reach the waybed. And by then, the scent was undeniable. Skin discolored, the abdomen swollen with gases, fluids leaking from the mouth and nose. For the embalmer, this was just the beginning. The first and perhaps most infamous step in the process was brain removal. The ancient Egyptians believed that the brain served no purpose in the afterlife. In fact, they considered it a nuisance, a wet, perishable organ that needed to be eliminated before it spoiled the skull. So the embalmers removed it, not with finesse, but with a metal hook. The hook was long and thin, made of bronze and shaped to slide through the nostril into the skull. Once inserted, it was twisted and stirred violently to turn the brain into a soft pulp. Imagine the resistance of tissue giving way, the sound of squelching, the smell that rose up as the hook did its work. The embalmers didn't wear gloves. Their hands were bare. Once the brain had been thoroughly liquefied, the head was tilted and the mixture drained out the nostrils. Sometimes the body was even shaken to speed the process along. It was messy, disgusting, and absolutely necessary. For poorer families, there wasn't always the time or money for such hands-on methods. In these cases, embalmers might use chemicals instead, injecting caustic substances through the nose to dissolve the brain. The result was the same: a skull emptied of soft tissue. But the risks were higher. One misstep, and the liquid might splash back into the worker's eyes or onto their skin, causing burns or illness. There were no protective masks, no sanitation protocols, only a job to finish. With the brain gone, the next step was far more invasive: evisceration. This part of the process was known as the gutting, and it was as horrifying as it sounds. The body was laid flat, and a small incision was made on the left side of the abdomen. The tool of choice was usually a flint or obsidian blade, sharp but brittle. Through this cut, the embalmer reached inside to remove the internal organs: lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines. The heart, however, was left inside. Egyptians believed it was the seat of intelligence and emotion, the one organ needed in the afterlife to face judgment. Removing the organs was not a clean operation. These bodies were not fresh. The embalmer had to push their hands into warm, decaying tissue, cutting, pulling, and scooping with their fingers. Fluids poured out. Bile leaked from the stomach. The smell was unbearable. And yet, this was just another day on the job. Once removed, the organs were washed and dried with natron, a naturally occurring salt with powerful dehydrating properties. Each organ was then placed into a special jar, known as a canopic jar, each protected by a different deity. The lungs went to Hapi, the baboon-headed god; the stomach to Duamutef, who had the head of a jackal; the intestines to Kebesenuef, the falcon-headed protector; and the liver to Imseti, the human-faced guardian. These jars were sealed and entombed with the body, but the man who made the initial cut, the parashistes, was treated differently from the others. Despite doing a necessary task, he was considered ritually impure. In some rituals, he would be symbolically chased away by his fellow embalmers, even pelted with stones. It was a strange contradiction. His work was sacred, but his presence was defiling. After the organs were removed, the cavity inside the body was washed with palm wine and stuffed with aromatic herbs. This wasn't for health. It was to mask the smell. Then came the most time-consuming part of the process: the drying. The body, now empty and hollow, was completely covered in natron. Bags of the salt were packed inside the body, while the rest was buried beneath a mound of powder. It would stay like this for 40 full days. Why 40? Because centuries of trial and error taught embalmers that 40 days was the ideal amount of time to fully dehydrate the human body. Any less, and the tissue might rot. Any more, and the skin might crack. During this time, the embalming tent would be filled with the smell of salt and slow decay. Rows of bodies, in various stages of dehydration, lay covered like salted fish. Embalmers worked quietly, checking each one, adjusting the natron, brushing off mold, shooing away insects. They rarely spoke. Death surrounded them. When the 40 days were over, the body was no longer soft. It had transformed, the skin leathery, the features sunken. This was not the peaceful mummy of museums. It was a dried-out husk, and it had to be made beautiful again. This stage, the final preparation, was known as the beautification. First, the body was washed again, usually with Nile water. Then it was rubbed down with oils and resins, frankincense, myrrh, cedar. These substances masked odor, softened the skin, and gave the corpse a lifelike sheen. The hollow body cavity was stuffed with linen, sawdust, and sometimes even scented spices. The goal was to restore volume, to make the deceased look more like themselves. The embalmers worked meticulously, hands sticky with resin, eyes watering from the smoke of incense. They wrapped amulets in layers of linen, placing them carefully on key parts of the body, on the chest, the arms, the forehead. Each amulet had a purpose: protection, healing, strength. The wrappings themselves were done layer by layer, sometimes hundreds of meters of linen used on a single body. The work was repetitive, slow, and utterly exhausting. Wrapping one mummy could take days. Yet even after all this, the embalmer received no praise, no reward, no glory. For those outside the embalmer's world, the horrors stopped at the surface. The stench, the gore, the endless contact with the dead. But for those who worked within the Wabet day after day, that was only the beginning. There were dangers here that no one could see, threats that crept into their skin, into their lungs, into their minds. Death wasn't just something they handled, it was something they breathed in, something they wore on their skin, something they risked becoming a part of. The first and most obvious danger was infection. In the ancient world, there was no concept of germs or disease transmission, but the dead were teeming with bacteria. When a person died, the body didn't simply rest. It decayed, fast. And inside that decomposition process were microbes and pathogens that could easily jump from corpse to living flesh. The embalmer's hands, arms, and sometimes faces were frequently splashed with fluids. One small cut, one nick on a finger, one slip of a blade. That's all it took. Many bodies carried diseases like tuberculosis or leprosy. Others died of unknown illnesses that left no external marks, but were just as lethal to those handling them. There were no gloves, no antiseptics. If a worker developed a fever, a rash or a sore, there was no treatment, only the hope that their body would fight it off. Some embalmers died quickly. Others fell into slow decline, coughing, limping, covered in lesions. No one mourned them publicly. The job was dangerous by design, and everyone knew the risks. But the threat wasn't just biological, it was chemical. The materials used in embalming were powerful and, over time, deadly. Natron, the salt used to dehydrate the body, may have been effective against bacteria, but it was brutal on human skin. Constant exposure dried out the embalmer's hands until they cracked and bled. Dust from the natron floated in the air, coating their lungs. Workers developed chronic coughs, rasping breaths, and frequent nosebleeds. The longer they worked, the worse it got. Then there were the resins, sticky, tar-like substances heated over open flames. These weren't just fragrant, they were toxic. The smoke they produced when boiled filled the tent, clinging to everything. Eyes stung, throats burned. Many embalmers developed chronic respiratory conditions. Breathing was hard. Speaking became hoarse. Some even went blind. Not suddenly, but slowly, their vision clouded by years of exposure to caustic fumes and airborne irritants. Occasionally, even more dangerous substances entered the mix. Mercury and arsenic, known even then for their preserving qualities, were sometimes used to treat certain bodies, especially those of the wealthy. But these elements were silent killers. There was no way to detect their slow accumulation in the body. No warning, only symptoms: fatigue, tremors, confusion. By the time an embalmer felt sick, the damage was already done. Add to this the physical toll. A corpse is not light, nor is it easy to maneuver, especially one that is bloated, stiff, or already falling apart. Embalmers had to lift, roll, and reposition bodies multiple times during the process. They had to reach inside, pull out organs, tilt heads, bind limbs. This repetitive strain led to chronic back problems, aching joints, and muscle injuries. Wrapping alone was exhausting. Hours spent hunched over, stretching and tucking linen again and again until every inch of the body was covered. Hands cramped, backs ached, feet throbbed from standing on hard-packed ground for hours. There were no breaks, no ergonomics, no relief, just the next body and the next. Beyond the physical suffering came the mental weight. Imagine spending every day among the dead, not the peaceful dead, but the grotesque dead, the recently stabbed, the plague-ridden, the accident victims, bodies bloated, burned, or mutilated, some so far gone that their features were unrecognizable. These weren't serene portraits of the afterlife. These were reminders of how fragile, how violent, and how cruel life could be. Over time, embalmers became numb. They had to. Emotions were a luxury they couldn't afford. Some stopped feeling anything at all. Others developed nervous tics or fell into depression. Nightmares were common. So was insomnia. There are even reports, rare but persistent, of embalmers breaking under the pressure, speaking to the dead, or developing strange rituals of their own to cope with the horror. And through all this, society turned its back on them. Despite their essential role in the journey to the afterlife, embalmers were viewed with suspicion and disgust. They were considered ritually impure. The work they did, cutting, gutting, handling flesh, was seen as defilement, no matter how necessary it was. They lived on the fringes, often in separate quarters or villages. They were allowed near temples, but only to work, never to worship. Socially, they were outcasts. People avoided them in the streets. Children whispered about their smell. Their clothes were permanently stained with resin and salt, their skin marked by burns and cuts. No matter how clean they tried to be, the stench of death followed them everywhere. It clung to their hair, their breath, their nails. Marriage was difficult. Many embalmers married within their own caste. Other embalmers, or labourers, associated with death. Outside relationships were rare and often met with resistance. Who would want to marry a man who spent his days inside corpses? Even within their profession, hierarchies existed. The parashistas, who made the initial cut into the body, was ritually cursed, symbolically chased away. He was vital to the process, but treated as the lowest of the low. Others in the hierarchy, those who handled the wrapping or applied the oils, might look down on him. It was a brutal irony. The more necessary your task, the more you were shunned for performing it. This contradiction defined the mummy maker's life. Revered in theory, reviled in practice, they were both the architects of immortality and the casualties of it. And yet, there was another dimension to their work, one that pulled them even deeper into the underworld of the dead, the business. Mummification was not charity, it was a service, and like any service, it came with a price. Despite its religious overtones, mummification was an industry. And like any industry, it operated on a system of costs, labor, materials, and demand. Death in ancient Egypt was not only a spiritual passage, it was a business opportunity. For the mummy makers, this meant that their suffering didn't just come from the horrors of the job itself, but from the systems around it that demanded more, faster, and cheaper results. There was no one-size-fits-all service. Mummification came in tiers. The wealthiest patrons, nobles, high officials, and royalty could afford the most elaborate and time-consuming rituals. Their bodies would be treated with rare imported resins, wrapped in hundreds of layers of fine linen, and buried in lavish tombs filled with food, amulets, and furniture for the afterlife. These high-end mummifications were prestigious, and the embalmers took their time. Every incision was careful. Every amulet was placed with symbolic precision. The result would be a mummy that looked near lifelike, with painted facial features and adorned in golden masks. For these, the embalmers were sometimes temporarily elevated in status, though never truly accepted. But most bodies didn't get this treatment. Most Egyptians couldn't afford such luxuries. Instead, they paid for what they could. Middle-tier mummifications were more hurried, using cheaper materials and fewer rituals. In some cases, the body might not even be fully eviscerated. Instead, Embalmers would inject chemicals to rapidly dry the internal organs while still inside the corpse. The external wrappings might be sparse, the resins minimal, and the final resting place no more than a communal tomb or sand-covered pit. Then there were the poor, the majority. Their dead were often treated quickly, with the bare minimum needed to qualify as mummified. Sometimes this meant simply packing the body in natron and wrapping it hastily. No amulets, no organs removed, no oils or resins, just enough to preserve the body for burial. For the mummy makers, these lower-tier clients meant dealing with advanced decomposition, poorly stored bodies, or even multiple corpses at once. There was no dignity in this work. The pressure to move quickly, to clear the backlog of bodies, meant they had little time to process what they were doing. The same brutal steps, performed faster, with less care. All of this took supplies, lots of them: linen, oils, herbs, natron, jars, blades, incense. These weren't always easy to come by. Natron, for instance, had to be harvested in specific regions, often transported over long distances. Resins like frankincense and myrrh were imported from distant lands, making them expensive and sometimes unavailable. When shortages happened, embalmers had to improvise. Lower quality materials were substituted. Linen might be reused. Herbs might be stretched thinner. In extreme cases, jars were faked, filled with sand or pebbles and sealed to simulate a proper burial. This was dangerous territory. If a family found out their loved one was not properly prepared, it could lead to accusations, violence, or worse, the wrath of local priests who governed purity laws. But the worst jobs weren't even for human beings. By the later periods of Egyptian history, a new trend had emerged: the mass mummification of animals. This wasn't rare or symbolic, it was industrial. Cats, ibises, baboons, falcons, even crocodiles. Millions of animals were mummified as votive offerings to the gods. People would buy them and offer them at temples, hoping to curry favor from deities like Bastet, Thoth, or Horus. These animals were raised, killed, and embalmed in staggering numbers. For the embalmers, this meant more work, endless work. Unlike human mummification, which had some level of ceremony, animal mummification was a conveyor belt of gore. The animals were often sacrificed en masse. Some were strangled, others were clubbed or drowned. The bodies were small, but the numbers were overwhelming. Embalmers had to eviscerate and wrap thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of creatures per year. The process was faster and rougher. Many animals weren't even mummified properly. Wrappings were minimal. Bodies were partially decomposed. In some cases, the mummy contained no body at all, just bones, or even just dirt. These fraudulent mummies were sold like holy trinkets. But the work itself was no less revolting. Picture a pile of dead kittens, their bodies limp, eyes still open, or baskets full of decaying birds, feathers matted with blood. The embalmer's hands moved on instinct: cut, remove, dry, wrap, repeat. No rest, no time, no meaning, just volume. If the human mummies were about dignity and ritual, the animal mummies were about profit and production. And for the mummy maker, both required the same price: their health, their sanity, and their place in society. Even after death, an embalmer might not receive the same rites he had performed for others. His body, viewed as unclean in life, might be buried without ceremony, without wrapping, without a tomb. In a cruel twist, the man who spent his life preparing others for the afterlife might not reach it himself, at least not in the way he was taught to believe. Yet somehow, the work continued, generation after generation. Fathers trained sons. Skills passed down not through pride, but necessity. For many, It was the only trade available. Once marked by the stink of death, there was no going back. In the grand mythos of ancient Egypt, the names of pharaohs were carved into stone. Their tombs were filled with gold, their stories told for thousands of years. But the mummy makers, the men who made all that possible, left no names, no monuments, only the lingering shadow of a job no one wanted to speak of, yet couldn't do without. Despite their critical role in Egyptian society, mummy makers were seen as spiritually contaminated. In a culture that was deeply obsessed with purity, both physical and ritual, constant contact with the dead placed embalmers outside the bounds of everyday life. They were the paradox of ancient Egypt, necessary but unwanted. The impurity associated with touching the dead was not a vague superstition. It was a strict religious boundary. Death was a spiritual disruption, a force that had to be contained and controlled. Priests performed purification rites before and after funerals, and mourners bathed and abstained from certain foods or activities. But for the embalmers, who touch corpses every day, there was no escape from this impurity. It clung to them like a curse. This wasn't just symbolic, it had real consequences. Embalmers were often forced to live on the outskirts of towns, in designated quarters, away from temples and marketplaces. They couldn't participate in many religious rituals. They weren't allowed to touch sacred objects. In some towns, they weren't even permitted to enter certain buildings. Their children might be shunned at school. Their wives, if they had them, faced constant judgment. And yet, the contradiction was sharp. These same embalmers were summoned when a high official died. They were needed to ensure that a soul could pass through the trials of the afterlife unharmed. Their skills were demanded by the elite and the common alike. The society that rejected them also depended on them completely. Nowhere was this hypocrisy more visible than in the treatment of the parashistas. The parashistas was the man who made the initial incision in the body, the one who physically opened the flesh and began the defilement. This was the moment that most clearly violated religious norms. And so, even though he was trained and skilled, even though he performed a vital function, he was ritually cursed. In some accounts, after making the cut, the parashistas was forced to drop his knife and run as fast as he could, while his fellow workers threw stones and shouted curses behind him. It was a symbolic act, a ritual punishment for defiling the body, even though he was doing exactly what they needed him to do. This bizarre performance illustrates just how uneasy the Egyptians were about the entire mummification process. They revered the result, but the act of turning a decaying corpse into a preserved form, that was dirty, dangerous magic. It had to be done, but no one wanted to look at it too closely. As a result, the embalmers lived in a strange shadow world. Not quite outlaws, but not accepted either. Their knowledge was respected, but their presence was tolerated at best. It didn't help that their work was often surrounded by secrecy. The exact methods of mummification were rarely written down in full. Instead, they were passed orally, guarded like family secrets. This was partly to protect their livelihood. If everyone knew how to do it, the service wouldn't be worth paying for. But it also reinforced their separation. What they knew was forbidden to most, sacred, dangerous. Even among themselves, there were layers of hierarchy and mistrust. Apprentices started young, often as boys, and were assigned the dirtiest tasks: fetching natron, disposing of removed organs, scrubbing down equipment. Only after years of silent labor would they be permitted to assist with wrapping or oiling. And few ever rose to the level of full embalmer. Most simply aged into the role by attrition after others died, left, or became too sick to continue. There was no retirement, Embalmers worked until their bodies gave out, hands arthritic, backs bent, eyes burned by resin smoke, and still they worked. Some grew bitter, others grew numb. A few came to believe that they were cursed, not metaphorically, but literally, marked by the gods for a life among the dead. And who could blame them? After all, every day they faced corpses in various stages of decay. Some were fresh, others were horrifying, bodies swollen with gas, oozing fluids, teeming with insects, corpses that had been half eaten by jackals before they were found, victims of drowning, their flesh bloated and discolored, children, infants, whole families. There was no way to avoid the trauma, no room to grieve, no space to feel horror. The embalmer had to distance himself or break apart. In a world so deeply concerned with eternity, the irony was brutal. The men who ensured eternal life were denied dignity in their own. And still the work continued. Because as long as death existed, the embalmer was needed. He could not leave his trade. He could not escape the smell of resin and salt. He could not shake the feel of linen and leathered skin beneath his fingers. It was part of him now, part of his breath, part of his blood. And as the tomb doors closed behind yet another nobleman, sealed for eternity in golden silence, the embalmer would step back into the heat, into the flies, into the makeshift tent where another body already waited. There was no glory, only the next job. If death had a rhythm in ancient Egypt, it beat through the hands of the embalmers. Not the priests chanting hymns in alabaster halls, not the scribes copying spells onto scrolls, but the quiet men, buried in work, who did the impossible. They fought the natural collapse of the human body, every hour, every day. There was something unrelenting about the routine. When one body was complete, another replaced it. When one set of organs had been sealed away in canopic jars, another pile of viscera was being pulled from a freshly cut cavity. Time didn't stop, nor did the decay. Even when the embalmers slept, the bodies they hadn't yet reached continued to rot in the stifling heat. This is the part most people misunderstand, that embalming wasn't just a process. It was a race against time. Egypt's climate, while ideal for preservation in dry sand, was brutal for the living. The combination of humidity from the Nile and scorching sun meant that a dead body could bloat and split within hours. Embalmers often had to work at night just to slow the decomposition. And with every passing hour, the job became harder, more putrid, more hazardous, more humiliating. Sometimes bodies were delivered already in catastrophic condition. Travelers who died far from home, merchants whose ships had returned too late, slaves who were found days after collapsing. These corpses didn't come with clean skin and peaceful expressions. They came with maggots, with limbs stiff from rigor mortis, with stomachs burst open from internal gases. And it was the embalmer's job to fix them, or at least make them look whole again. They would patch faces with linen soaked in resin, build cheekbones from sawdust, sew mouths shut, paint lips back into existence. They became sculptors of the dead, not for beauty, but for memory. The body had to be recognizable to the soul. It didn't matter how disfigured it was in life or death. The embalmer had to restore it, but nothing could truly restore the health of the embalmers themselves. Their exposure to rot and fumes came with a cost they couldn't see until it was too late. Many of them developed lesions on their hands that never healed, respiratory infections that lingered for months. Some lost their teeth from constant exposure to chemicals. Others coughed up blood, unable to breathe deeply after years of inhaling burning oils and decayed flesh. They had no physicians, no temples of healing, and no one to care for them when they finally collapsed from exhaustion or illness. For those who endured long enough, the pain simply became part of their day. A raw patch of skin on the forearm, a tightness in the chest, a limp. These things became permanent, reminders that their bodies were following the same slow decline they fought against in others. And yet, perhaps the greatest cruelty of all was that the embalmers left almost no trace in history. For a civilization that documented nearly everything, from harvests to star positions, the mummy makers were mostly invisible. They didn't carve their names into tombs. They didn't write scrolls about their methods. Most were never depicted in art. When they did appear, it was often as nameless figures in the background, handling jars or tending to linen. This wasn't just cultural erasure, it was deliberate. Embalmers were kept in the margins, needed but never celebrated. Their craft was essential, yet considered unclean. Their expertise unmatched, but their identities disposable. They were buried in common graves when they were buried at all. Often their own mummification was rushed or omitted entirely. Their bodies, like their lives, were treated as something functional, something necessary, but not something to be remembered. Even in death they served. Their absence in the written record has led many to believe that mummification was a clean, sacred ritual performed by priests in temples. The truth was far more brutal. It was a job, a physically and emotionally destructive job, and someone had to do it. Some embalmers may have found small comfort in their routines, in the motions of wrapping, oiling and sealing. Others likely hardened into resignation. There's no evidence of rebellion, of mass refusal. Perhaps they felt chosen, or trapped, or simply born into a role they could never escape. But make no mistake, the life of a mummy maker was a sacrifice, not of the grand, ceremonial kind, but the slow, corrosive kind, the kind that eats away at your body, that cuts you off from society, that stains your skin, your breath, your soul. And in the end, what did they get? Not glory, not gold, just more bodies. The ancient Egyptian obsession with death was never about endings. It was about what came after, the journey of the soul, the trials in the underworld, and the hope for eternity in the field of reeds. For the wealthy and powerful, mummification was their passport. A preserved body meant an undisturbed soul. But for the mummy makers, death wasn't a philosophical concept or a spiritual mystery. It was a job soaked in blood, bile, and bitterness. They didn't have the luxury of thinking about the afterlife. They were too busy removing pus from bloated intestines, too busy dragging decomposing bodies off riverboats, too busy picking out larvae from eye sockets. Their world was here, in the land of the living, surrounded by the dead. And still, the demands never slowed. The embalmers saw the contradictions clearly. They worked for men who feared death, but wouldn't dare speak to the people who touched it. The rich wanted to be gods in death, but they hired those they treated like the lowest form of life to make it happen. And once the wrappings were complete, once the masks were placed and the rituals performed, the mummy makers vanished. The priests took over. The crowds mourned. The family wept. No one mentioned who prepared the body, who endured the filth, the pain, the isolation. There were no thanks, no rewards, no recognition. Only the next corpse. Even the tools they used outlived them. Embalming hooks and knives were passed down, not as heirlooms of honor, but as burdens of survival. A boy born to a mummy maker rarely had a choice. From the moment he could walk, he smelled natron. He heard the squelch of rotten flesh. He saw things no child should ever see. And in time, he became numb to them, or he left if he was lucky. Some tried to escape, to take up other trades, but society didn't forget. The stink stayed with them. The rumors followed. Once marked by death, always marked. A man who once touched the dead would always be impure. It was a brand, invisible but irreversible. And yet, despite all this, the horror, the rejection, the endless suffering, the embalmers endured. Why? Maybe because the work gave them a twisted kind of purpose. Maybe because no one else would do it. Or maybe because, deep down, they believed that helping others reach the afterlife might earn them mercy in their own death. Maybe that's what they clung to as their fingers wrapped another set of bandages, as their lungs burned from another pot of boiling resin, as their names were forgotten while the names of the dead were carved in stone. If there's a lesson buried beneath the linen and salt, it's this. The architects of immortality were men who lived with none. They handled the worst of death so others could be remembered forever. They gave their health, their dignity, and their lives to build a bridge between the living and the divine, a bridge that history crossed without ever turning back to look at who built it. So the next time you walk through a museum, past a perfectly preserved mummy in a glass case, stop. Look closer. Look past the golden mask and linen wraps, past the hieroglyphs and canopic jars. Behind all of it is a story of hands, rough, burned, trembling, that made eternity possible. Hands that belonged to someone who spent their life with the dead, so others could be remembered forever.